What if a single, unscripted moment was enough to end one of television's most legendary comedies overnight? That is exactly what happened to The Honeymooners, a show that redefined the sitcom with its raw, working-class humor, only to be brought down by a moment so unsettling it was buried for decades. One line, delivered differently than ever before, silenced the studio audience and sent shockwaves through an entire network. This is the story they try to hide, a collision of political blacklist, sponsor panic, and a live broadcast that crossed an invisible line. Jackie Gleason's story did not begin under bright studio lights or in the comfort of a Hollywood mansion. It began in a cramped Brooklyn apartment, the kind where every creak of the floorboards carried the weight of real struggle. Born in 1916, Gleason was raised in a tough Irish-American neighborhood. His father abandoned the family when Jackie was just 9 years old, leaving his mother to hold things together with low-paying jobs and long, exhausting hours. That kind of loss shapes a person. For Gleason, it created a deep well of frustration, ambition, and grit that would later pour directly into the character of Ralph Cramden. Gleason did not have the luxury of a clear path into show business. He spent much of his youth hustling, pool halls, odd jobs, and whatever it took to bring in money. The neighborhood itself was a theater of raw personalities, loud arguments spilling from tenement windows, neighbors who lived paycheck to paycheck, and people whose dreams were always a little bigger than their means. These were the voices, the mannerisms, and emotional rhythms he would eventually channel on live television. When Gleason yelled as Ralph Cramden, it was not just acting. It was Brooklyn coming back to life in front of the cameras. His real big break came not through a sitcom, but through the variety stage. Gleason's natural charm and sharp comic timing gave him an almost magnetic appeal with audiences. By the early 1950s, he had his own television show on the Dumont network called Cavalcade of Stars. In 1951, Ralph Cramden was introduced to the world, not as a refined version audiences would come to know, but as a crude, loud, impatient man always plotting his next scheme. Television audiences, used to seeing cardigan-wearing TV fathers dispensing sage wisdom, suddenly found themselves watching a man shouting across a tiny apartment at an equally sharp-tongued wife. It was electric. When The Honeymooners began catching on, much of its success came from the chemistry between Ralph and Alice Cramden. In the early Cavalcade of Star sketches, that chemistry was defined by Pert Kelton, the original Alice. Kelton was not simply a straight man to Gleason's over-the-top Ralph. She had a sharp tongue, a quick wit, and a way of looking Ralph up and down that could cut him to size without a single word. She brought genuine rawness to the role that matched the rough edges of the early episodes. Then Kelton vanished. The official statement cited health reasons, a polite, vague explanation that was nearly standard practice in the 1950s when networks wanted to avoid scandal. But those who worked on the show knew the real story. The Red Scare, the nationwide hunt for alleged communist sympathizers, was at its peak. Her husband was being investigated for possible ties to communist elements. In that atmosphere of fear hovering over both Hollywood and New York television, Kelton became untouchable. She was never formally charged. There was no evidence of wrongdoing. But CBS quietly pushed her out, calculating it far more convenient to do so without public fanfare. Replacing her was no simple task. Alice Cramden was never a minor character. She was the one person who could stand up to Ralph. The actress had to portray a long-suffering spouse without ever becoming a pushover. Audrey Meadows was not the obvious choice. CBS executives dismissed her as too glamorous during her initial audition. Meadows, however, knew exactly what they meant and set out to prove them wrong. She showed up with a brand new set of headshots that were the opposite of Hollywood sparkle. Plain dress, hair unstyled, no makeup. In those photographs, she did not look like a movie star. She looked like a working-class wife in Brooklyn stretching every dollar. Jackie Gleason saw the photos and knew instantly she was right for the role. Once Meadows settled into the character, the chemistry shifted in a significant way. Kelton's Alice had been loud and brash, always quick to match Ralph's energy and volume. Meadows' Alice was more grounded. Her sharp wit remained, but delivered in a calm, measured tone that made Ralph's bluster seem even bigger by comparison. Rather than yelling back, she let his anger burn itself out before delivering a line that left him completely shaken. The show found a new rhythm, one that balanced Gleason's explosive intensity with a quieter, underlying strength. When The Honeymooners spun off into its own series in 1955, television was a very different place. The airwaves were filled with pristine living rooms, neatly dressed parents, and smiling children who learn a moral lesson by the end of each episode. Shows like Father Knows Best and Leave It to Beaver presented an idealized America, clean lawns, tidy homes, and fathers who always had the perfect advice. That was what television was supposed to be, reassuring, orderly, and above all, safe. Jackie Gleason had no interest in playing it safe. The Honeymooners threw out almost every unwritten rule of the sitcom playbook, gone were the polished suburban houses. In their place stood a cramped Brooklyn apartment with peeling wallpaper and a kitchen table that served as the family's hub for arguments, hopes, and disappointments. Instead of children delivering cute one-liners, there was just Ralph and Alice, a married couple locked in a constant push and pull between dreams and reality. The genius of the show lay in its honesty. Ralph Cramton was no wise, steady patriarch. He was a working-class bus driver with an overactive imagination, a short temper, and an extraordinary ability to unwittingly sabotage his own plans. Alice was no passive homemaker. She was sharp-tongued and stood her ground. The characters were flawed, and that was exactly what made audiences connect with them. They did not look like the shiny images on TV commercials. They looked like the people sitting in the living rooms watching them. Each episode stood alone as a complete story with its own emotional arc. No ongoing plot threads to track, no serialized drama to follow, just Ralph, Alice, and the chaos of one new scheme per week. Catchphrases like "To the moon, Alice," and "Baby, you're the greatest" became instant cultural touchstones, finding their way into workplaces, dining rooms, and even political speeches. The show opened the door to a new kind of character, one who could be simultaneously unlikable and deeply human. Without the Honeymooners, there may never have been an Archie Bunker, a Roseanne Connor, or a Homer Simpson. It happened on a night no one expected. The date was October 1956, and the episode was titled The Deciding Vote. On the surface, it was pure Honeymooners territory. Ralph Cramton, convinced that a single vote could swing a local election, winds up tangled in misunderstandings, self-importance, and inevitable humiliation. The script was clever, the premise relatable, and the live studio audience was ready for laughs. For most of the episode, everything went as planned. Gleason was in his element, larger than life, quick with improvisations, feeding off the energy of the room. Then came a moment that changed everything. During a heated exchange between Ralph and Alice, Gleason delivered his trademark bang, zoom, straight to the moon line. It was a phrase the audience had heard countless times before, a comic threat that had become a running joke. Only this time, it did not sound like a joke. The delivery was sharper, colder. Gleason's body language shifted. The space between him and Audrey Meadows seemed to shrink. His voice dropped into a register devoid of its usual comedic exaggeration. The punchline landed with a thud. No chuckles, no applause, silence. The silence weighed heavily in the studio air, with crew members backstage later saying they froze mid-task. For the first time, Ralph Cramton looked not like a lovable blowhard, but like something genuinely dangerous. This was all unfolding on live television. Every twitch, every pause, every unplanned emphasis played out in real time to millions of living rooms across the country. In an era when domestic violence was a strictly taboo subject on television, certainly never depicted with any hint of realism, that moment felt disturbingly raw. Critics who had praised the show for its honesty now called the scene too real. Letters began arriving at CBS, not fan mail, but expressions of concern. Behind the scenes, there was already unrest at the network. Ratings, while respectable, had slipped slightly. Sponsors were complaining about the increasingly edgy tone of the show, and live broadcasts were becoming riskier as an unpredictable Gleason grew harder control. The moon line had always walked a fine edge between comedy and threat, but this time it had clearly tipped. CBS executives held urgent private meetings. One major sponsor threatened to withdraw its support entirely if the edgier moments were not toned down. That was enough to seal the decision. No press release, no scandal, just a quiet, whispered end to the original 39 episodes, The Honeymooners. For Gleason, The cancellation was more than a professional setback. Ralph Cramton was not just another character. He was a piece of himself, pulled from the streets of Brooklyn and brought to life through years of live performance. Friends later said he took it personally, as if someone had told him his life's work was not good enough. In a highly unusual move for the period, Gleason secretly bought back the rights to the Honeymooners from CBS, ensuring he retained full control over the characters and their future. Over the next 2 decades, he revived Ralph, Alice, and Ed Norton in sketches on variety shows. The chemistry was still there and the laughs still came, but the passionate urgency of those original 39 episodes could never truly be recaptured. By the time a Miami-based revival in the mid-1960s faded from view, it might have seemed that the Honeymooners was destined to remain a fond but distant memory. Yet something remarkable happened instead. Through reruns on local stations filling daytime and late-night slots, the show found an entirely new generation of viewers. Younger audiences who had never known the 1950s were meeting Ralph, Alice, and Norton for the first time, and falling in love. The very qualities that had once made the show risky, the working-class setting, the sharp marital arguments, the deeply flawed characters, now felt fresh and alive compared to polished sitcoms of the later decades. The infamous bang, zoom, line once at the center of the show's most uncomfortable moment, became a piece of Americana, quoted, parroted, and referenced everywhere from cartoons to political speeches. Critics came to recognize the Honeymooners as a genuine pathfinder for character-driven comedy. Ralph Cramton's impossible ambition and bottomless frustration, Alice's mix of toughness and compassion, Norton's wacky loyalty. All of it echoed through decades of future television. Even animated couples like Fred and Wilma Flintstone carried Cramton DNA. In 1985, on the show's 30th anniversary, retrospectives and celebrations confirmed what audiences had long known. The Honeymooners had earned its place as one of the most important sitcoms in television history. The very controversy that had once threatened to sink it became nothing more than a footnote, an odd chapter in the story of a series whose influence only grew with time. The infamous scene that pulled the Honeymooners off the air was not just a mistake. It was a turning point for the show, for Jackie Gleason, and for American television itself.